The neighbors used his pool without permission, ignoring all requests to leave him alone. But one day, his patience broke, and he did something no one expected. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching this from. Michael Reed stood at the edge of his new backyard, surveying the sparkling pool that stretched out before him. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the water, its surface reflecting the neatly trimmed hedges and the clear blue sky above. This was sanctuary, his haven and retreat after years of relentless work and personal challenges. For Michael, it wasn't just a backyard, it was the embodiment of a dream he had nurtured for years, one that he had finally turned into reality. After his divorce 3 years ago, Michael had thrown himself into his career. As a civil engineer specializing in urban infrastructure, he worked long hours managing complex projects. The intensity of his work left little time for a personal life, but that was a sacrifice he was willing to make. When his promotion came through earlier that year, Michael decided it was time to reward himself. He sold his cramped apartment in the city and moved to the suburbs, purchasing a spacious single-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac. The house had everything he had ever wanted: a modern kitchen with stainless steel appliances, a large living room with vaulted ceilings, and most importantly, a backyard with a pristine pool. The pool had been the deciding factor. It represented an oasis of calm, where he could escape the demands of his job and the lingering loneliness that came with living alone. Here, he imagined relaxing weekends with a book in hand, the cool water inviting him for a swim whenever he needed to unwind. The neighborhood, too, seemed ideal. On his first visit, the quiet streets lined with neatly kept homes gave off a welcoming vibe. The real estate agent had emphasized how friendly the community was, describing block parties, shared holiday celebrations, and a sense of camaraderie among the residents. While Michael wasn't particularly interested in becoming the life of the neighborhood, he appreciated the idea of living in a place where people respected each other's space. That was what he wanted most of all: space, both physical and emotional, to rebuild his life on his own terms. The day he moved in, Michael was greeted warmly by his neighbors. Across the street lived the Thompsons, an elderly couple who waved from their porch as the moving truck pulled up. To his right was a young couple with a baby, who offered him cookies as a welcoming gift. But the most memorable introduction came from the family next door, the Harrisons. The Harrisons were hard to miss. Robert Bob Harrison, the father, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a booming voice and an easy smile. His wife, Sarah, exuded the kind of polished friendliness that made her seem like the perfect host for any neighborhood gathering. Their 3 children, teenage twins and a younger daughter, hovered nearby as Bob shook Michael's hand with a firm grip. "Welcome to the neighborhood, man," Bob said, his grin wide and confident. "You've got yourself a great spot here. That pool is gonna be a hit. My kids are already jealous." Michael chuckled politely, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to such forwardness, but he appreciated the gesture. "Thanks. It's a nice place. Looking forward to settling in." Sarah chimed in, "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We're just next door, and we've been here for years. This is a great community, you'll love it." Michael thanked them and excused himself, eager to get back to unpacking. The Harrisons seemed pleasant enough, but their energy was a bit overwhelming for someone who valued solitude as much as Michael did. Still, he reminded himself that being part of a neighborhood meant some degree of interaction, and he resolved to maintain a polite but distant relationship with his new neighbors. The first few weeks in the house were everything Michael had hoped for. He spent his evenings sitting by the pool, the soft glow of the underwater lights creating a tranquil ambience. On weekends, he swam laps in the morning and napped in the shade of the patio in the afternoon. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He also took note of the rhythm of the neighborhood. The Thompsons across the street had their grandchildren over every Sunday, their laughter echoing through the cul-de-sac. The young couple next door often jogged together in the early mornings, their baby snug in a stroller. As for the Harrisons, they were the most active presence on the street. Bob's booming laugh could be heard during his backyard barbecues, and the sound of the twins' basketball games often carried over the fence. At first, Michael didn't mind. The Harrisons' energy stayed confined to their own yard, and while it was louder than he preferred, it didn't infringe on his peace. But one Saturday afternoon, as Michael returned home from a run, he noticed something strange. A group of teenagers, none of whom he recognized, were splashing around in his pool. He stopped in his tracks, disbelief giving way to irritation. He had only moved in a month ago, and already someone had taken the liberty of using his property without permission. Approaching the backyard, he noticed the Harrisons twins among the group, laughing and diving into the water as if they owned the place. Michael cleared his throat loudly, and the teenagers froze, their laughter dying as they turned to face him. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. One of the twins, a boy with curly hair, shrugged. "We were just swimming. Pool's awesome, by the way." "Yeah, well, it's also private property," Michael replied. "I don't recall giving anyone permission to be here." The group mumbled apologies, quickly grabbing their towels and scampering out of the yard. As they disappeared through the side gate, Michael felt a mix of frustration and confusion. He hadn't expected this kind of boundary pushing in a neighborhood that had seemed so respectful. That evening, he stopped by the Harrisons' house to address the issue. Bob opened the door, a beer in hand, greeting Michael with his usual jovial demeanor. When Michael explained what had happened, Bob nodded along, his smile never wavering. Teenagers," Bob said with a chuckle. "They don't always think things through. I'll talk to them about it. Don't worry, it won't happen again." Michael wanted to believe him, but something about Bob's casual attitude didn't sit right. Nevertheless, he decided to let it go for now, trusting that the conversation would be enough to set boundaries. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a larger problem. He had moved here for peace and privacy, but it seemed that maintaining those things might be more challenging than he had anticipated. The following weeks were a strange mix of tranquility and tension for Michael. On the surface, life in his new neighborhood continued much as it had before. The Thompsons hosted their weekly family dinners, the Joggers kept their early morning routines, and Michael enjoyed peaceful evenings by the pool when he returned from work. Yet a nagging unease settled in the back of his mind, a sense that his personal space wasn't quite as inviolable as he'd hoped. The incident with the teenagers using his pool lingered like a stubborn stain on his thoughts. Bob's dismissive attitude had struck Michael as a red flag. While the man's easygoing nature might have seemed harmless to others, Michael had seen enough in his lifetime to recognize the subtle signs of someone who didn't take boundaries seriously. He resolved to keep an eye on the situation, hoping that his firm stance during their initial conversation would be enough to deter further incidents. But that hope proved short-lived. One Friday evening, after a particularly grueling week at work, Michael came home to find a familiar scene playing out in his backyard. The twins were back, along with a few of their friends. They were splashing and laughing, their voices carrying across the yard as if it were a public park. Michael stopped in his tracks, his pulse quickening. This time, they had even brought snacks. Their brightly coloured bags of chips and soda cans scattered across the poolside furniture. Michael didn't bother with pleasantries. He marched into the yard, his expression stern. The group noticed him almost immediately, their laughter faltering as they registered his presence. "What's going on here?" Michael asked, his voice calm but edged with unmistakable irritation. The twins exchanged guilty glances before one of them, a tall, lanky boy named Alex, spoke up. "We just thought, since it's hard out, maybe you wouldn't mind." "I do mind," Michael said firmly. He gestured toward the gate out now. The teenagers scrambled to gather their things, muttering half-hearted apologies as they left. Michael stood by the pool, watching them go, his frustration mounting. This wasn't just about kids being kids, it was about respect or lack thereof. The pool, which had once symbolized a sanctuary, now felt like contested territory. That evening, Michael decided to address the issue more formally. He drafted a polite but direct note, reminding the Harrisons that his property was private and that any further intrusions would not be tolerated. Early the next morning, he slipped the note into their mailbox and returned to his house, hoping that this would finally put an end to the problem. For a few days, it seemed like his message had been received. The twins stayed out of sight, and the pool remained undisturbed. Michael began to relax, allowing himself to believe that the situation had been resolved. He even considered introducing himself to a few more neighbors, hoping to establish friendly but respectful connections. But then came the Saturday afternoon barbecue. Michael had spent the morning running errands, and when he returned home around midday, He was greeted by the unmistakable sound of laughter and music emanating from his backyard. His stomach sank as he parked his car and walked to the side gate. Peering through the slats, he saw a full-fledged gathering in progress. Bob, Sarah, their kids, and at least a dozen others were lounging by the pool, grilling burgers and sipping drinks as if they owned the place. Michael's first reaction was disbelief. How could anyone think this was acceptable? He took a deep breath, steadying himself before pushing the gate open and stepping into the yard. The scene froze for a moment as everyone turned to look at him. Bob, standing by the grill with a pair of tongs in hand, greeted Michael with a broad smile. Completely unbothered. "Hey, Michael. Hope you don't mind. We thought we'd make the most of this beautiful day. Your pool's too nice not to share." Michael clenched his jaw, choosing his words carefully. "Bob, this is my property. You can't just show up here with a crowd of people and act like it's yours." Bob laughed, the sound grating against Michael's nerves. "Oh, come on, man. We're neighbors, no harm, no foul, right? Besides, you weren't using it." Michael's patience, already wearing thin, snapped. "That's not the point. This is my home, my space. You need to leave, all of you." The guests began to murmur uncomfortably, some exchanging awkward glances. Bob's smile faltered, but only slightly. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need to get worked up. We'll clear out." It took them another 15 minutes to actually leave, during which Michael stood silently by the gate, arms crossed, making it clear that he wasn't budging until every last guest had gone. When the yard was finally empty, he surveyed the aftermath. Scattered trash, damp towels, and a half-eaten plate of food left on one of his lounge chairs. That evening, as Michael cleaned up the mess, he felt a heavy sense of disillusionment settle over him. He had moved here for peace, for privacy, for a chance to build a life that was truly his own. Yet barely a month in, he was already locked in a battle to defend his boundaries against neighbors who seemed to have no concept of them. As the sun set and the yard grew quiet, Michael sat by the edge of the pool, staring into its calm, rippling surface. For the first time, it didn't feel like a haven, it felt like a battleground. And he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the worst was yet to come. The days following the barbecue were quiet, but not in a way that brought Michael any peace. The Harrisons seemed to take his demand to leave as a temporary setback, rather than a definitive boundary. The silence felt more like a lull before the next storm, a tense waiting period during which Michael began to notice subtle shifts in their behavior. Bob, who had once greeted him with a jovial wave whenever their paths crossed, now offered only a tight-lipped nod. The twins avoided eye contact altogether. Even Sarah, usually bubbly and cheerful, seemed colder during chance encounters. Michael wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or concerned. On one hand, the absence of further intrusions was a welcome change. On the other, the Harrison standoffishness hinted at something unspoken, as though they were silently regrouping for another push. Michael's instincts told him to stay alert, and he was soon proven right. The next incident occurred on a breezy Saturday morning. Michael had spent the first half of the day mowing his lawn and pruning the hedges around his backyard. With a glass of iced tea in hand, he sat down on his patio to enjoy the fruits of his labor. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was soothing. Birds chirping, a lawnmower rumbling in the distance, the faint chatter of children playing somewhere nearby. For a moment, Michael felt at ease. That moment was shattered by the sound of splashing. Michael froze, his grip tightening on the glass. The unmistakable noise of people jumping into the water came from his pool, accompanied by bursts of laughter. His stomach sank as he turned his head toward the source of the commotion. Sure enough, a group of teenagers was back and they weren't alone. The Harrisons twins had brought along more friends this time, and they were all having what appeared to be an impromptu pool party. Loud music blared from a portable speaker perched precariously on one of Michael's patio chairs. Michael stood, his chest tight with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. This wasn't just a casual mistake or misunderstanding, it was blatant disregard for his property. He walked toward the pool, his shadow stretching across the water as the teenagers turned to face him. "What do you think you're doing?" Michael demanded, his voice steady but firm. The group exchanged nervous glances before one of the twins, Alex, spoke up. "We thought you were cool with it," he said, his tone half apologetic, half defensive. "It's just a pool, man." Michael's patience had worn thin. "It's my pool," he said sharply. And I've made it very clear that you're not allowed to use it without my permission. Get out now." The group hesitated for a moment, as though they were debating whether to argue. But Michael's unwavering expression left little room for negotiation. Muttering under their breath, they climbed out of the pool, grabbing their towels and belongings. The speaker emitted a loud crackle as someone hastily switched it off. As they filed out through the side gate, Michael caught Alex muttering to one of his friends, "He's such a buzzkill." Michael ignored the comment, but it stung more than he cared to admit. When the yard was empty once more, Michael stood by the pool, staring at the rippling water. His sanctuary, once a source of pride and solace, now felt tainted. He had moved here to escape chaos, but it seemed to have followed him. The Harrisons' persistent intrusions weren't just an annoyance, they were an attack on the life he had worked so hard to build. Michael spent the rest of the day thinking about how to address the situation. He considered calling the Harrisons directly, but previous interactions with Bob had shown that the man wasn't inclined to take Michael's concerns seriously. The idea of involving the authorities crossed his mind, but Michael hesitated. As a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, he was acutely aware of how such situations could escalate. The last thing he wanted was to be labeled as the problem neighbor or, worse, to find himself in a confrontation that spiraled out of control. Instead, Michael decided to document everything. He began keeping a log of each incident, noting the date, time, and details of what had occurred. He even installed a small security camera on the corner of his house, aimed discreetly at the backyard. If the Harrisons continued to push boundaries, he wanted evidence to back up his claims. The following weekend brought yet another escalation. Michael returned home from the grocery store to find Bob and a group of his friends lounging by the pool, beers in hand. They had brought a portable grill and were flipping burgers on Michael's patio, as though it were a public park. The smell of sizzling meat mixed with the scent of chlorine, creating an almost surreal juxtaposition. Michael approached the group, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Bob greeted him with the same disarming grin he had used during their first meeting. "Hey, Michael. Hope you don't mind. We figured we'd keep the kids entertained while we watch the game." Michael's voice was cold. "I do mind, Bob. I've told you before, this is my property. You can't just come here whenever you feel like it." Bob's grin didn't falter, but there was an edge to his tone as he replied, "Relax, man. We're just neighbors hanging out, no harm, no foul." Michael took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "This isn't up for debate. You and your friends need to leave now." The tension was palpable as the group exchanged glances. Finally, Bob raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. We'll clear out, no need to make a scene." It took them nearly half an hour to pack up their things and leave, and when they were gone, Michael was left with the yard littered with empty bottles, crumpled napkins, and the lingering smell of smoke. As he cleaned up the mess, a mix of anger and exhaustion settled over him. He couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, waiting for the next intrusion. Something had to change. That night, Michael lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He felt trapped in a battle he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. The Harrisons clearly didn't respect boundaries, and polite conversations weren't going to fix that. He needed to find another way to assert his ownership of his space, something that would make it clear once and for all that his home was off limits. As the hours ticked by, an idea began to take shape in his mind. It was unconventional, maybe even a little risky, but it had the potential to send a message the Harrisons couldn't ignore. Michael didn't want conflict, but if they forced his hand, he was prepared to fight for his peace. By the time Monday morning rolled around, Michael had made up his mind. The events of the past weekend left him no choice but to act decisively. If the Harrisons wouldn't respect his boundaries after repeated warnings, he would have to get creative. Confrontation wasn't his style, he preferred solutions that were subtle but effective, leaving no room for further arguments. And so, seated at his desk during a rare quiet moment at work, Michael began researching. The idea had come to him late Saturday night as he lay in bed, replaying the scene by the pool over and over in his mind. He didn't want to involve the authorities or escalate the situation to the point of open hostility. Instead, he needed something that would reclaim his space without direct confrontation, something that would make it clear to the Harrisons that the pool was not theirs to use. His thoughts turned to pool maintenance. Over the years, he had learned the basics of keeping a pool clean and safe. But now he dove deeper into the subject. He read article after article about water chemistry, chlorine levels, and pH balance, searching for a solution that was both harmless and dramatic enough to send a message. It wasn't long before he found exactly what he was looking for: superchlorination. It was a common pool maintenance process that involved adding an elevated amount of chlorine to the water to kill bacteria and algae. When done properly, the water would be temporarily cloudy and uninviting, rendering the pool unusable for several days. To someone unfamiliar with pool care, it could look like a chemical disaster, harmless but intimidating. Michael's plan was simple. He would create a scene that would deter the Harrisons from ever attempting to use his pool again. He even considered adding a harmless foaming agent to enhance the visual impact. The goal wasn't to scare anyone physically, but to create enough of a spectacle that no one would want to come near his property for a long time. Over the next few days, Michael gathered the supplies he needed. He visited a pool supply store on the edge of town, where he purchased a large container of chlorine granules and a foaming agent often used in themed pool parties. He also bought a testing kit to ensure that his pool's water would return to normal after the stunt. Everything had to be done carefully and methodically. Michael wasn't about to risk damaging the pool he had worked so hard to maintain. Each evening after work, he fine-tuned his plan. He researched the exact proportions of chemicals needed to create the desired effect, and ran small-scale tests in a bucket to ensure that the foam wouldn't damage the pool surface. By Thursday night, he was confident that everything was ready. All that remained was to wait for the right moment. Michael didn't have to wait long. On Saturday afternoon, as the sun reached its zenith, Michael returned home from the grocery store to the now familiar sound of laughter and music coming from his backyard. He paused in his driveway, taking a deep breath as his hands tightened around the steering wheel. This time, he wasn't angry or surprised. He was prepared. He parked his car, unloaded the groceries into the kitchen, and then retrieved the supplies he had carefully stored in the garage. With the small bucket of chlorine granules in one hand and the foaming agent in the other, Michael made his way toward the backyard, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and determination. When he reached the gate, he paused to take in the scene. The Harrisons were out in full force, along with at least a dozen other people. Bob stood by a portable grill, flipping burgers, while Sarah handed out drinks. The twins and their friends were splashing in the pool, and someone had set up a speaker that blasted pop music loud enough to rattle the windows. Michael opened the gate and stepped inside. No one noticed him at first, too caught up in their revelry to acknowledge his presence. He walked purposefully toward the pool, setting the bucket and foaming agent down at the water's edge. Finally, Bob noticed him. "Hey, Michael." "Just in time," he said, raising his beer in a mock toast. "Glad you could join the party. Grab a drink and relax, man." Michael ignored him. Without a word, he knelt by the pool and began scooping chlorine granules into the water. Almost immediately, a chemical reaction began. The water bubbled and churned, releasing small plumes of steam as the chlorine dissolved. A few people noticed and stopped what they were doing, their laughter fading into confused murmurs. "What's he doing?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with concern. Michael stood, reaching for the foaming agent. He poured it into the pool in a slow, deliberate stream, watching as the water began to froth. Thick white bubbles rose to the surface, spreading rapidly until the entire pool was covered in a layer of foam. The previously clear water turned a murky, uninviting grey. Now everyone was staring at the pool in stunned silence. The music from the speaker seemed oddly out of place against the backdrop of confusion and growing unease. Finally, Bob stepped forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "What the hell is this, Michael?" he demanded. Michael turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute. "Pool maintenance," he said simply. "The water's not safe for swimming right now. You should probably leave." Bob's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to argue. But the sight of the bubbling, foaming pool behind Michael seemed to sap his confidence. He glanced back at his guests, many of whom were already gathering their belongings and murmuring about heading home. Sarah placed a hand on Bob's arm. "Let's go," she said quietly. "We'll talk about this later." One by one, the guests trickled out of the yard, leaving behind only Bob, Sarah, and their kids. Bob lingered for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Michael. But in the end, he said nothing. With a final, frustrated shake of his head, he turned and walked away. his family following close behind. When the yard was empty, Michael let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. He looked down at the foamy, clouded pool and smiled faintly. It wasn't the peaceful oasis he had envisioned when he bought the house, but for now, it would do. More importantly, it was his oasis, and he intended to keep it that way. As he began cleaning up the leftover supplies, Michael couldn't help but wonder how the Harrisons would respond. He knew this wasn't the end of the conflict, it was only the beginning. But for the first time, he felt like he had the upper hand. And that was a good start. The aftermath of Michael's bold move played out much as he had anticipated, though the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The day after the incident, the Harrisons' backyard was unusually quiet. No loud laughter, no clinking glasses, no teenagers bouncing basketballs on the driveway. It was as if the entire family had retreated into their house to regroup and process what had happened. Michael, meanwhile, spent the day meticulously cleaning the pool. The foamy water and chemical imbalance had served their purpose, and now it was time to restore his oasis to its pristine condition. He tested the pH levels, adjusted the chlorine, and ran the filtration system until the water sparkled once more. The process was laborious, but for Michael, it was worth it. Each bucket of clean water he added to the pool felt like reclaiming a piece of his space. By mid-afternoon, the yard was back to the serene refuge it had been when he first moved in. Michael sat on a lounge chair with a glass of iced tea, enjoying the sound of birds chirping in the trees overhead. For the first time in weeks, his backyard felt like his own again. The peace lasted until Monday morning. Michael was sipping his coffee and reading emails when he heard the doorbell ring. Setting his mug down, he walked to the door and opened it to find Bob standing on the porch. The man's posture was tense, his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw clenched. His usual jovial demeanor was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculated. "Morning," Michael said evenly, keeping his expression neutral. "We need to talk," Bob said, his tone curt, "about what you did to the pool." Michael raised an eyebrow, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What I did to my pool, you mean?" Bob's nostrils flared. "Don't play games with me, Michael. That stunt you pulled ruined my weekend. Everyone who came over left thinking your pool's some kind of toxic hazard." Michael fought the urge to smirk. "Well, Bob, if your weekend was ruined, maybe it's because you were trespassing on my property. I've told you before that the pool is off limits, but you didn't listen." Bob stepped closer, his voice lowering to a growl. "You didn't have to go that far. We're neighbors, for God's sake. This is supposed to be a community." Michael's patience was wearing thin. He straightened, meeting Bob's gaze without flinching. "Respecting someone's property is part of being in a community, Bob. I've asked politely, but you ignored every word I said. If you don't like the consequences, maybe you should think twice before walking into someone else's yard uninvited." Bob opened his mouth to respond but stopped short, as though realizing he wasn't going to win this argument. He took a step back, shaking his head. "Fine. You've made your point. But don't expect anyone around here to take your side if you keep pulling stunts like that." Michael gave a small, non-committal shrug. "I'm not looking for sides, Bob. I'm looking for peace. That's all I've ever wanted." Without another word, Bob turned and walked back toward his house. Michael watched him go, a mix of relief and weariness settling in his chest. The conversation had gone about as well as he had expected. Bob was angry, but not outright confrontational. Still, Michael knew better than to assume the matter was resolved. Bob didn't strike him as someone who gave up easily. For the next few weeks, the Harrisons kept their distance. The twins no longer sneaked into the yard, and Bob's booming voice was noticeably absent from the neighborhood. It was almost as if they had finally taken Michael's warnings to heart. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was a temporary reprieve or pause, rather than a resolution. The rest of the neighborhood, however, seemed to notice the tension. Michael received a few curious glances from other neighbors during his evening walks, and the Thompsons, who lived across the street, even stopped him one afternoon to ask how things were going. "You've been awfully quiet over there, Mrs. Thompson said, her tone friendly but probing. "I hope everything's all right." Michael smiled politely. "Just been busy with work." "Things are fine." She gave him a knowing look, as though she suspected there was more to the story but decided not to press the issue. "Well, if you ever need anything, you know where to find us." Michael thanked her and continued his walk. feeling both grateful for the support and wary of the neighborhood gossip that might be brewing. He had no intention of dragging anyone else into the mess with the Harrisons. This was his problem to handle, and he would see it through alone. The tension reached its peak 2 weeks later. Michael was relaxing in his living room one evening when he heard a loud knock at the door. He opened it to find Sarah Harrison standing on his porch. Her expression a mixture of frustration and apology. "Michael, can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer than her husband's but no less urgent. Michael stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. They sat at the dining table, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah fidgeted with her hands, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for the right words. "Look," she finally said, "I know things have gotten tense between us. And I know Bob can be a bit much sometimes. But this whole situation is getting out of hand. The kids don't understand why they can't go swimming anymore. And Bob feels like you're singling us out." Michael took a deep breath, keeping his tone measured. "Sarah, I'm not singling anyone out. I'm protecting my property. I've tried talking to Bob, but he doesn't listen. I've been more than patient, but enough is enough." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I get it. Really, I do. And I'll talk to Bob again. I hope we can move past this. We're neighbors, after all." Michael hesitated before replying. "I want that too, Sarah. But it has to start with boundaries. If Bob and the kids respect my space, there won't be any more problems." Sarah smiled faintly. "Fair enough. I'll do my best." After she left, Michael sat alone at the table, his thoughts churning. He wanted to believe that things could improve, that the Harrisons would finally learn to respect his boundaries. But a small voice in the back of his mind warned him not to let his guard down. The conflict might have quieted down, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The days following Sarah's visit were oddly peaceful. For the first time since the ordeal began, Michael felt a sense of calm return to his home. The Harrisons seemed to be making an effort to respect his boundaries. The twins no longer loitered near the property line, and Bob's boisterous voice no longer echoed through the cul-de-sac. Even the loud weekend barbecues had ceased. It was as if the family had taken Michael's warnings and actions to heart, or at least decided it wasn't worth the trouble to continue pushing. Michael took the opportunity to fully reclaim his space. He spent a weekend tending to his backyard, restoring it to the haven he had envisioned when he first bought the house. The patio furniture was cleaned and rearranged, the lawn meticulously trimmed, and the pool returned to its crystal-clear perfection. Sitting by the water with a cold drink in hand, Michael finally felt a sense of accomplishment. His backyard was his again. Yet, despite the outward peace, Michael couldn't shake a lingering unease. The Harrisons were quiet, but the abrupt shift felt almost too good to be true. Bob didn't strike him as the type to back down so easily. And Michael couldn't help but wonder if this calm was just a prelude to another storm. The neighborhood, meanwhile, seemed to take notice of the change. Michael often caught his neighbors casting curious glances his way as he went about his daily routine. During a trip to the local grocery store, he ran into Mr. Thompson, who greeted him with a warm smile but quickly shifted the conversation toward recent events. "Been pretty quiet on your end lately, Mr. Thompson remarked, his tone light but probing. "Everything all right with the Harrisons?" Michael hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Things are fine," he said carefully. "I think we've come to an understanding." "Good to hear, Mr. Thompson replied, though the look in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Bob can be a bit stubborn, but he's not a bad guy. Just take some time to figure out how to deal with him." Michael forced a smile, nodding politely before changing the subject. He had no interest in fueling neighborhood gossip, but the conversation left him with a nagging sense that his feud with the Harrisons had become a topic of discussion among the residents. That evening, Michael sat on his patio, staring at the pool as the sun dipped below the horizon. He thought about everything that had transpired over the past weeks. His initial excitement at moving into the neighborhood, the mounting frustration with the Harrisons, and the drastic measures he had taken to protect his space. While he didn't regret his actions, he couldn't ignore the toll the conflict had taken on him. What should have been a peaceful new chapter in his life had turned into a battle for boundaries, leaving him drained and wary. As the weeks passed, the tension in the neighborhood began to ease. The Harrisons remained distant but cordial, offering a nod or a polite wave when their paths crossed. Michael continued his routine, enjoying the quiet and rebuilding his sense of normalcy. But the experience had changed him. He found himself more guarded, more cautious about interactions with his neighbors. The dream of a tranquil suburban life felt slightly tarnished, its edges dulled by the reality of navigating complex social dynamics. One Saturday morning, as Michael sipped his coffee on the patio, he noticed something unusual. Bob was standing in his own backyard alone, his gaze fixed on the fence that separated their properties. After a moment, he approached the fence and cleared his throat, catching Michael's attention. "Hey," Bob called, his voice lacking its usual bravado. "Got a minute?" Michael hesitated before setting his coffee down and walking over to the fence. "What's up?" Bob rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncharacteristically sheepish. "Look, I just wanted to say, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I know we've been a pain, and I get why you were upset. I guess I didn't realize how much the pool meant to you." Michael studied Bob's face, searching for any hint of insincerity. To his surprise, the man seemed genuine. His usual cocky grin was replaced by a tentative expression, one that spoke of an effort to make amends. "I appreciate you saying that," Michael replied carefully. "I've just worked hard for this place, and I needed you to understand that." Bob nodded. "I get it, I do. And I'll make sure the kids know to stay out of your yard from now on. No more uninvited pool parties, I promise." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them finally starting to dissolve. While Michael wasn't ready to fully trust Bob, he could sense that this was a step in the right direction. "Thanks," Michael said finally. "That means a lot." Bob offered a small smile before turning and heading back to his house. Michael watched him go, feeling a cautious sense of relief. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Over the next few days, Michael noticed subtle changes in the Harrisons' behavior. The twins greeted him with polite hellos when they saw him, and Sarah waved from her car as she pulled out of the driveway. Bob even stopped by one afternoon with a six-pack of beer as a peace offering. While they weren't exactly friends, the animosity that had once defined their relationship was slowly being replaced by mutual respect. Michael allowed himself to hope that the worst was finally behind him. The quiet he had eluded him for so long now felt real, and for the first time since moving in, he began to truly feel at home. Months had passed since Michael and Bob's tentative truce. The neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm, with families chatting over fences, children running bikes on the quiet streets, and weekend barbecues filling the air with the scent of grilled food. Michael found himself relaxing into the life he had envisioned when he first moved in. The Harrisons had kept their word: no more uninvited guests in his yard. No more late-night parties echoing through the cul-de-sac. The peace felt earned, and Michael cherished it. But there was a nagging thought that Michael couldn't quite shake. While the conflict with the Harrisons had subsided, the distance between him and his neighbors lingered. He didn't want to be seen as the recluse or, worse, the troublemaker. The idea of bridging that gap had been brewing in his mind for weeks, and after much consideration, he decided on a solution: a neighborhood barbecue. Michael's decision was pragmatic as much as it was social. Hosting a gathering on his own terms would allow him to set clear boundaries, while showing his neighbors that he was open to community and connection. It was a way to mend fences, figuratively speaking, and perhaps even build some goodwill in the process. The Saturday before the event, Michael spent the day preparing. He scrubbed the patio, cleaned the grill, and carefully planned a menu that balanced simplicity with flavor. Burgers, hot dogs, grilled vegetables, and a few side dishes. He even made a batch of his mother's famous potato salad, a family recipe that had been a hit at every gathering he could remember. Michael personally delivered invitations to the neighbors on his street, keeping the tone light and welcoming. He invited the Thompsons, the young couple next door, and a few others he had spoken to in passing. When he reached the Harrisons' house, he hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. Sarah answered, her expression wary but polite. "Hey, Sarah," Michael said with a smile. "I'm hosting a barbecue tomorrow afternoon, and I'd like you and your family to come. A chance to reset, you know." Sarah blinked, clearly surprised, before returning the smile. "That sounds nice. Thanks, Michael. I'll let Bob know." The next day, the weather was perfect, sunny with a gentle breeze. Michael had set up tables with plenty of seating, laid out a spread of food, and even filled a cooler with ice-cold drinks. As the guests arrived, Michael greeted each of them warmly, making small talk and introducing himself to those he hadn't met before. The Thompsons were the first to arrive, followed by the couple with the baby, and then, to Michael's surprise, the Harrisons. Bob looked hesitant as he approached Michael, a bottle of wine in one hand. "Thanks for the invite," he said, his tone unusually subdued. "Didn't think you'd want us here after everything." Michael waved off the comment. "It's water under the bridge, Bob. Today's about starting fresh." Bob nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Sarah and the kids followed close behind, each offering polite greetings. Michael noticed the twins looking around the backyard, their expressions a mix of nostalgia and restraint, as though they weren't quite sure how to behave now that the pool was off limits. Michael smiled inwardly, appreciating their newfound respect for his space. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere became increasingly lively. The smell of grilled food wafted through the air as neighbors chatted and laughed, their voices mingling with the soft hum of music playing from Michael's portable speaker. The Harrisons, to Michael's surprise, blended seamlessly into the group. Bob shared stories about his days as a college athlete. Sarah chatted with the Thompsons about gardening, and the twins helped a group of kids set up a game of cornhole. Michael kept a watchful eye on the proceedings, making sure everyone was comfortable and that the boundaries he had worked so hard to establish remained intact. To his relief, the guests respected his unspoken rules. No one wandered too close to the pool, and everyone cleaned up after themselves, leaving the yard as pristine as it had been at the start of the day. Later, as the sun dipped low on the horizon and the party began to wind down, Michael found himself standing by the grill with Bob. The two men had hardly spoken all afternoon, each seeming content to let the event serve as a quiet olive branch. But as the last of the food was cleared away, Bob broke the silence. "Look, Michael," he began, his voice low, "I know I've said it before, but I want to say it again. I'm sorry for the way we acted. We didn't respect your space, and that was wrong." Michael turned to face him, surprised by the sincerity in Bob's tone. "I appreciate that," Michael said, "and I'm glad we've moved past it. I just hope we can keep things respectful from here on out." Bob nodded, his expression earnest. "We will. I promise." For the first time since their conflict began, Michael felt a genuine sense of understanding between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet, anyway, but it was a start. As the last of the guests left and the yard fell quiet, Michael stood by the pool, watching the moonlight dance on its surface. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not just from the success of the barbecue, but from the realization that he had taken control of his life and his space. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught him the value of standing up for himself and the importance of setting boundaries. For the first time in months, Michael felt truly at peace. His home was no longer just a place to live, it was his sanctuary, his retreat, and a space he could finally call his own. The weeks following the barbecue marked a turning point for Michael. The event had been a success, not just in fostering goodwill among his neighbors, but also in solidifying the boundaries he had fought so hard to establish. The Harrisons, once a source of frustration and conflict, had transformed into respectful if still somewhat distant neighbors. Bob kept his word, and Michael hadn't experienced a single intrusion on his property since the gathering. The neighborhood seemed to notice the change as well. During his evening walks, Michael was met with warm smiles and friendly greetings from people who had previously avoided eye contact. The Thompsons occasionally waved him over for a chat on their porch, and the young couple next door even invited him to join them for a game night. Michael didn't mind being included, but he was careful to balance the interactions with his need for solitude. After everything he had been through, he wasn't eager to sacrifice the peace he had finally achieved. One Saturday morning, as Michael sipped his coffee by the pool, he noticed the Harrisons twins playing basketball in their driveway. Their laughter carried across the yard, but it no longer grated on him as it once had. Instead, it blended into the background, part of the suburban harmony he had sought when he moved here. The twins glanced his way and, to Michael's surprise, waved. He returned the gesture, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was a simple interaction, but it felt like progress. As the weeks turned into months, Michael found himself settling into a rhythm. His workdays were long but fulfilling, and his evenings were spent enjoying the tranquility of his home. The pool became his haven, once more a place where he could swim laps under the stars or simply sit and reflect on how far he had come. The change in his relationship with the Harrisons was subtle but significant. Sarah occasionally stopped by with a plate of cookies or a new recipe she thought he might like. Her gestures sincere and free of the forced politeness that had characterized their early interactions. Bob, too, had softened. While they weren't close, he often exchanged a few words with Michael over the fence. Their conversations light and easy. One afternoon, Michael came home to find a handwritten note on his doorstep. It was from Bob, inviting him to a small barbecue the Harrisons were hosting that weekend. Michael hesitated, the memories of their earlier conflicts flashing through his mind. But as he looked at the note, he realized that this was a chance to close that chapter on their rocky start and truly move forward. On the day of the barbecue, Michael arrived with a bottle of wine in hand. Bob greeted him at the door, his usual bravado tempered with a genuine warmth that Michael hadn't seen before. The gathering was smaller and quieter than the chaotic pool parties of the past, and Michael found himself enjoying the easy camaraderie that had taken root. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Michael lingered for a moment, chatting with Sarah and Bob by the grill. They talked about everything from gardening tips to local news, their conversation free of the tension that had once defined their relationship. For the first time, Michael felt like he was part of the community, not just an outsider looking in. That night, as he walked back to his house, Michael paused by the pool, the moonlight reflecting off its surface. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the challenges, the conflicts, and the lessons he had learned along the way. This space, this home, was more than just a place to live. It was a testament to his resilience, his ability to adapt, and his determination to create a life that was truly his own. As he stood there, the quiet hum of the neighborhood around him, Michael smiled. The peace he had fought for was no longer elusive. It was here, in the stillness of the night and the calm waters of the pool. It was in the laughter of children playing down the street and the friendly waves of neighbors. He now saw him as part of their world. Michael took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The battles of the past were behind him, and the future stretched out before him like the calm, inviting waters of his pool. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt truly at home. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great stories like this one. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.